Hello, and this is going to mainly be a discussion about Schopenhauer. But before that, I wanted to look at some other thinkers first and round some ends in my post-Hegelian um, um, part of this series. And so, first, I wanted to talk about Josiah Royce, who was a American philosopher who introduced really to philosophy in America the Hegelian politic of the spirit of the community that you kind of see around us to this day. And I also wanted to look at the American idea of personal idealism, which goes really with the terms without needing any description beyond that, but that sort of personalized journey and personal interpretation, really, if you will. And you can see how a Hegelian metaphysics can lead to something like personal idealism and the personal mission, the personal identity, really. And another thing to perhaps consider is the characteristics of reality. Out of this, of course, is of utmost importance towards how much is appearance, how much are appearances, and how many degrees of does it complement the realness, as it were, as opposed to just the phenomenal and noumenal distinction. And this is kind of important to consider with Schopenhauer later. He definitely messes a lot with the Kantian distinction there. And before we get to him in later videos, Whitehead also, in his Process and Reality, and his model of sense perception and the degreeness out of that and how it's perceived. And it's also interesting to look at the concept of evil as well, and its restraint to the degree of the order of nature, and how our bodies as we age tend to go against nature. We decompose, we age in the process of becoming, if you will. And there's nothing really necessarily driving this. It's just something that sort of happens within the order. And so how can evil fit into that? And so for some of the metaphysicians out of this, God is not in control of everything. Evil has its own irrational element and its own reality of, and so basically it's pinpointing that God actually has a sort of finite interaction with his creation. But yeah, I just wanted to split up some ends here and look at a couple thinkers. Obviously, Whitehead is going to be someone we're going to look at in depth later. But now I wanted to turn to Schopenhauer and his main concept and work of world as idea. And the basic schema would really be phenomena and will as the noumenal of reality and appearance, and the underlying nature of reality is the nature of my will and my idea. And so basically what he's trying to say, and of course the main schema that he always is going to reference is, especially in this work, is his fourfold root of sufficient reason, which is ground and consequence, cause and effect, space, time, and of course motive and action within the will, or world as me and world as my idea. Cause and effect would be physical effects, the causal necessity, if you will, for something to be true. Space and time as a transcendental aesthetic, the mathematical, the sort of Kantian scientific reasoning, which is kind of interesting to consider that he does go at Kant a lot for what I think, honestly, Kant is talking about, science instead of a sort of, metaphysics for everyday life. But we're just kind of splitting hairs here. But anyway, and then moral necessity, which is all in the realm of phenomena. And so, of course, in history of philosophy, sufficient reasoning, this is obviously harking back to Leibniz in the ordered monad for sufficient reason, which is, the causal principle, if you will, the necessity in the world. For Leibniz, of course, the best of all possible worlds is the one that's only possible and only ordered in this way. Whereas Schopenhauer is looking at it more from a phenomenology of, the lived body experience. Will is, the movement of the body to mediate through our lived body perception, of course, in the, Kantian scheme of, body perception, our sense perception, being the center of his will for his own metaphysical scheme, and that goes back to that as well. Will for Schopenhauer is a sort of a priori, outside of any principle of plurality, and it's ultimately unified, as opposed to these things being in an absolute, as Hegel's scheme would have been. And this ultimately leads him to say that this is, the worst of all possible worlds, because you're going to always have to deal with this philosophy of pessimism, as he talks about in other works. That sort of will and urge, the urge to move, if you will, obviously in the lived body experience alone is this sort of, gnawing towards existence, a striving, and if it's not tamed, then you have boredom and pain distinctions. This goes back, honestly, to the Greeks, and it's interesting that I've referenced this before on the channel, that sort of Spengler decline scheme, if you will. Here Schopenhauer is obviously talking a lot of pain and pleasure distinction, boredom, the unsatisfied will, and desire. We always want more. And so for Schopenhauer, pessimism out of this is that this is the worst of all possible worlds. And only through representation and sort of aesthetics and ideas we can turn away from this only temporarily. And our ethical system has that sort of sympathy of that sort of unsatisfied will that we all kind of agree upon through the lived body experience. And so repressing this will, though, trying to get away with it for Schopenhauer, is repressing and negating your own world of ideas. If you take his scheme to fruition. But as this little side commentary here, I think it's actually interesting to look at, Schopenhauer and the lived body experience. This is something that's interesting to me on the channel, obviously, and I think really unique to our experience today in the 21st century, because I think there is a metaphysical discussion that could be had here about, we seem to be going further and further away from the sensory output of our body and more towards this sort of digitized, abstract presence that I find very interesting and quite very alarming even. I've said that before too. And so, sufficient reasoning, how can we have this sort of, system of reason if the starting point of, sensory output and the lived body experience is beginning to go away from that? How do we have, the sort of moral, as he puts in, moral necessity of phenomena? How can it sustain itself if we are, moving away in this sort of virtual space? The idea I've talked about before of our sense perception over time really becoming synthetically stretched in how we're perceiving and forming abstract concepts in our political systems, through rights, if you will. And everyone has this sort of lived experience that they want to share, and we're supposed to, of course, aggregate out of that. But now you have this sort of virtual presence to contend with that is away from, lived body sense perception. And so I think it's really interesting. How can we, have a, sufficient reasoning with Schopenhauer if this is the case? Another thing I think is perhaps interesting to look at as well. And of course, there comes as well with the current political discussions around gender ideology and identity, and these sort of ideas of going against the lived human body that is given to you, and reversing it, or whatever the case may be, as a sort of indictment of the lived human body experience, and Schopenhauer's metaphysics here, as a sort of revolution against that, if you will, is also an interesting commentary to come out of it, I think. Because one of the things that's actually really interesting about Schopenhauer that he has to add on towards the discussion of rights is that, the causal principle that we thought was just simply within, human reason, extends to, the animal kingdom. To some degree, there's an understanding of that sort of cause and effect that isn't just unique to human beings necessarily. And it's interesting to see how obviously animal rights and its lineage can somewhat be traced to Schopenhauer in his discussions here. But that opens the door as well for how we contend with other life forms within nature, within the natural order, with the state of the virtual for us, and being as a whole. How we treat the creatures of nature, not just in this sort of environmental discussions today of veganism or environmentalism, but obviously in the modes of ideological opponents that could come to mind. It's certainly something to consider and think about when looking at these texts with Schopenhauer, and how we go about that today in the 21st century with the internet, and what that does to our sort of human body experience, and how it can actually affect the entire system of human reasoning, as it were, for Schopenhauer. But yeah, this is just a discussion video on Schopenhauer. I hope you guys interact with it and leave comments and like it if you do. The next one will start on Whitehead after this.